Haven't made a video in a while, but I thought tonight might be a good opportunity based off of my recent viewing of, make sure I say his name right, Baz Luhrmann's most recent release of Elvis, a film about Elvis Presley. There's a couple things you should know. Is one, I'm a big Elvis fan. I've been an Elvis fan most of my life. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee as a child, so that's where I spent my childhood. But I'm also an avid music collector, and particularly of early rhythm and blues, early rock and roll, rockabilly, soul, things like that. And Elvis is one of those figures who he kind of goes through these cycles in terms of popularity and also in terms of people's opinions about him and his music. And it's kind of one of my pet peeves because I spend a lot of time reading on Elvis, learning about him, learning his influence musically, and just about his overall lifestyle as a whole. He's obviously a very interesting and enigmatic figure. We know about the drug addictions, we know about his untimely death. But one of the things that often surfaces when it comes to Elvis is his relationship to the Black American community of the South, and the use of many of their songs early in his career to sort of push him into superstardom. And of course, the common sort of narrative you hear in the mainstream is that Elvis was basically just a white boy stealing the music of black musicians and then popularizing it with white audiences and becoming successful at it. And that's an easy way to try to sum it up, but unfortunately, well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, I should say fortunately, it's not really the true story. It's obviously a lot more complex. And Elvis's history with the question of race has been something he's dealt with his entire career, but oftentimes on the other end of the fence, which also just shows you how, depending on what point in history you're in, is going to depend on how people view things. There's been a lot written about this specifically by contemporaries of Elvis, many of the black musicians who he was friends with. In the film, we see characters like, notably B.B. King, who's portrayed as being a close friend of Elvis's. I did think that was a little overdone. B.B. King and Elvis were friendly. They, played music in the same areas. They recorded often in the same places, studios and things. They worked both with Sam Phillips. So they knew each other well. And B.B. King has spoken a lot about Elvis and really tried to put to rest the idea that, one, Elvis was in any way racist, and two, that he was essentially stealing from black musicians. If anything, King's pretty quick to credit Elvis for being largely influential to not only the white community, but also the black community, even in their music as well. So I kind of just wanted to put some clarifications out there and also talk about some of the actual songs and music that Elvis did record from the black communities of his era. I actually have some of the original 78s here that are very prized possessions in my collection. I can't play them for you because it will not allow me to do that on YouTube, but I can at least tell you the names of them and you can maybe look them up on Spotify. Before I get into all that, I just want to briefly maybe just talk about the film beyond the question of race and Elvis's relationship to music, and particularly the African-American music of that era, and just give you an overall view of the film itself. I'm not a huge fan of Baz Luhrmann. I've seen his other films, Moulin Rouge, whatever, Great Gatsby, I think some of those. They're kind of those types of films that are very colorful, they're very robust, they're very fun, but I tend to find that I kind of, by halfway through, I'm kind of over it. It's a little bit too much like sensory overload. So I was a little skeptical to watch this film, this most recent one, Elvis, for two reasons. One, I didn't know how I would feel about his particular interpretation of the film, but also I didn't know how he would portray the sort of relationship and the potential sort of elephant in the room around race with Elvis, as it's often a controversial subject matter. I'll say that I think he handled it fairly well. I do think, like I said, maybe a little bit overly played up the relationship that he had with some of his contemporary black musicians. But what I think that got completely erased and forgotten from the film was the impact also that Elvis pulled from the contemporary white music of his era. And that's something that, in order to really understand, we have to stop talking about Elvis for a minute and start talking about Sam Phillips. Now, Sam Phillips is mentioned in the movie. The casual music fan probably knows Sam Phillips was the person who started Sun Records, the record studio where Elvis would record his early tracks. But they may not know all the nuances of Sam Phillips' own life and his relationship with Elvis, and really why he got into recording music in the first place. So just by way of giving a sort of a brief backdrop or a biography of Sam Phillips, there's a couple things you need to know. One, he grew up very poor, like many of these stories start. He came from a sharecropping family. He lived in the community in the South. I can't remember if he was from, I don't think he was from Tennessee, maybe in Mississippi, Arkansas. I don't remember exactly where he first started living, even Alabama, where his family originated from. But they grew up with other poor families, both white and black, in his community, basically working as sharecroppers. And he was a good student, and he actually wanted to go to law school. That was his goal growing up. But unfortunately, because of the era he lived in and his family's financial situations, he, like many kids his age, was forced to quit school around the age of 15, 16 years old and start working on the farm. But it was either his father or grandfather, I can't remember the details, so forgive me, but he had a family member who was known as kind of being a local tinkerer, and he was good at fixing electronics and appliances. And his big thing is he'd get old radios, either from, like a junkyard or ones that people were throwing out, and he'd get them working again, and he'd resell them. And he often sold them to families in the black community that maybe didn't have radios or couldn't afford them otherwise. And Phillips developed a good rapport working with again, it was I think it was his father, but it may have been his grandfather doing this. And he also developed ability to really work with radios. And so as he got older and decided he didn't want to be a farmer, he actually got jobs working at some of the local radio stations. And what he developed was a really interesting ability to capture live music. People need to understand that back in that day, a lot of times they would record live shows or even bring musicians into the studios. If you've seen some of these old films like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where the guys actually come into the radio studio and perform there, they would do things like this. And what Phillips had kind of figured out was how to move the microphones around in such a way and use multiple microphones, which sounds obvious now, but apparently back in the day, they would just kind of put one central mic kind of up front, and they would just kind of, everyone would kind of sing or play, and they're just going to be like one sound. And he would kind of move things around and pick up the nuances of the music. And so he developed a little bit of a name for himself as kind of being the sound guy that you want if you're going to have people performing. But what Phillips found when he got into working with the sort of current music industry of that era is he found that all the people that he worked with tended to be the musicians that came in and recorded and were on these shows and were sort of successful. The people who were making records and that were popped on the radio tended to be people who were more educated, more upper class, could read and write music. And that wasn't the music that he grew up around. And he always felt like the music that he was surrounded with as a child was more enjoyable to him, and he thought that it was the kind of music that more people needed to hear. And so he had noticed in other forms of music, particularly like jazz, the music was integrated as well. If you know anything about the big band music and swing era of the early 1900s, a lot of these big bands were integrated. They had both black and white musicians playing in the band, which was interesting. You were talking about pre-segregated America. But for some reason, when it came to pop music and radio, that didn't exist. So eventually, as Phillips kind of saves up money and works as this sort of radio guy recording things, he decides he wants to start his own record studio in Memphis. And his whole purpose is to capture the music that he loves, which is essentially American vernacular music, of the people who are largely sort of parts of the people of the population, both white and black, that would not probably normally get a record contract or get a record made or get put on the radio. And so he really had an affinity for like bluegrass, country music, honky-tonk music, but also rhythm and blues, Mississippi Delta blues, and all these types of things. And so he wanted his doors to be open to anyone. Anyone who could play music could come and record there. He never had any interest actually in making a record label. So one of the interesting things about him is a lot of the music he recorded early on at Sun Studios end up being sent out to other labels like Chess and Checkers, which were larger affiliate labels in the North that primarily released black music. So, Phillips was the first guy to record B.B. King. He was also the first guy to record Howlin' Wolf, and is actually not only credited with discovering Elvis Presley, but also discovering Howlin' Wolf, which a lot of people don't even know. And it just goes to show you that this misconception about Sam Phillips as this guy who was out there looking for some white kid who could sing black music is what he was doing was not true at all. He was just trying to capture vernacular music. But he did have this passion that he believed music would transcend race and that it could bring people together and that good music would be good for everyone. And his real passion was to try to get all these types of music available to all people. And what he ran into, being a Southerner living in the 1950s in America, was barriers that I'm sure you can imagine. And that was, it didn't matter how good the music was that he was recording, he was not being received by radio DJs. He did note that the black radio stations tended to be more receptive and were more open to the idea of playing some of the country music or sort of honky-tonk bluegrass music. But when it came to trying to get the white radio stations to play the rhythm and blues music or Delta blues music that he was recording, he did not get well received. And again, some of this is just because of systemic racism, and some of this was just because of segregation laws, and people were probably concerned about perceptions and things like this for a variety of reasons. So it was always, though, about just the music, and the vast majority of people that Phillips recorded were black musicians. They just happened to be the people who came in, who had talent, and he didn't turn away, and like I said, he recorded some great music. And he worked a lot with, like I said, a lot of other people. It wasn't just those guys. He recorded all kinds of stuff. If you really go back and look at all the stuff that Sam Phillips did before he even created the Sun label, it's incredible. But when Elvis Presley came in, he initially came in to sing some pop music, Dean Martin, stuff like this for his mother. At least that's how the story goes. But when he showed that he had knowledge of a wide variety of music, including a lot of the rhythm and blues that was commonly being played on the black radio stations, Phillips found that very interesting. And when he found that he knew Arthur Big Boy Crudup and could play that song, he thought that was fascinating, and that was what he thought could work, because now you had an integration here of a person who was white, but yet playing traditionally black music. So this is where the sort of stereotype type goes of, oh, well, Elvis was just sort of the white kid who just took black music. But what a lot of people don't also realize is that when Elvis was at Sun with Phillips, he only released 5 45 singles, okay? So if you don't know, if you're not familiar with vinyl records, a 45 is a single and it has an A-side and a B-side. It's not a full album, okay? Elvis wouldn't release a full LP till he signed with RCA Victor. And on those 5 45s, you have, like I said, an A-side and a B-side, so it's 2 tracks. So in terms of the songs that Elvis actually physically released to the public through Sun Studios, there's only 10 songs. And 5 of them were songs that were previously recorded and were written by black musicians, and 5 of them were songs that were written and recorded by white musicians. So a lot of people don't realize it was literally right down the middle, half and half. And I don't think that was an accident, because again, if you think of what Phillips was trying to do, he was trying to branch or breach this world of music and bring all of these types of music together. And in Elvis, he saw a person who could do that in a unique way, which became the emergence of rockabilly music, okay? And what's really important about this is not only to recognize that on each of these albums, he has a song that's black music and a song that's white music, so there's an even amount of both. He wasn't just singing black music. Even if you go back and listen to some of these songs, and they're great songs. So this one is actually the original RCA Victor recording of Arthur Big Boy Crudup's That's All Right, My Mama. So this is the actual original, 78. If you go back and listen to it, it's great music, but it's clearly Delta Blues, okay? It definitely has a Delta Blues sound to it. These are 2 that he didn't record at Sun, but would later record at RCA Victor. So you have Big Mama Thornton's Hound Dog, which is also featured in the film, along with That's All Right, My Mama. And then one that wasn't featured, but is a great one too, which is the one that Wynonie Harris released on King Records, which is Good Rockin' Tonight, okay? So all of these songs, great R&B songs, blues songs. But if you go back and listen to them, and again, I can't play them for you, but if you pull them up on your Spotify or whatever, listen to them, you'll find they're great tunes. But they're still fundamentally different than what Elvis was doing. And that also goes true with the white music. If you go listen to Bill Monroe's Blue Moon of Kentucky, which is the song that Elvis released as the B-side with Arthur Big Boy Crudup's That's Right My Mama, it's a totally different song too. But what's the same when you listen to both is they're unquestionably Elvis, okay? Elvis had an unquestionably unique sound, and it was an unquestionably new way of organizing music that, yes, had already existed in other areas, blues, sort of country western, but he was fusing them and making them into something that kind of was its own. Now, you could argue that on the spectrum, he was probably closer to the sort of rhythm and blues side of things and maybe the country western side of things, but it also sort of just depends on the track, because certainly as Elvis's career goes on later, he does actually do a lot of country music, so and even gospel. So he kind of was all over the board, and I think that that's something that a lot of people don't understand, is that Elvis, even at the early stages of his career, was recording as many white musicians as he was black musicians, okay? Now, another thing that needs to be pointed out is that people think that this was a way of taking advantage of these, whatever, maybe this black music or things like that. It could be perceived as that way. But the reality is, people were thankful at that time for Elvis doing this. And I mean by people, I mean the black community was very thankful for Elvis and very happy. They liked Elvis. They were a big fan of his music and what he was doing. Because one, he was introducing their music to larger audiences, okay? And Elvis was really, really always good about crediting other people, okay? And actually, to Baz Luhrmann's credit, he has a scene, it's very brief, where they're like, oh, you're the king of rock and roll. And he's like, no, I'm not the king of rock and roll. You know, that's Fats Domino. Like, Elvis was always quick to defer and say, well, no, go listen to, Jackie Wilson. Yeah, his version's way better than mine. And so if he did use songs that other black artists sang, he was always quick to refer to them and sort of divert to give them attention. But more importantly, what a lot of people sort of fail to realize, or maybe just don't think about, is the fact that there's royalties in music. And when someone sings your song and it becomes successful, you make money off of it. And if it's Elvis Presley singing your song and he's making millions and millions and millions of sales, that's really good for the person who wrote that music. And this is precisely why that when Elvis does go on to record at RCA Victor, he has the pick of the litter, because every songwriter in America, or really in the world, wants Elvis Presley to sing their song, because not only will it give them recognition, hey, I got a song that's Elvis sang, it will make them rich. So, arguably, the real thing is, it's unfortunate that Elvis didn't record more black musicians. Because the reality is, after Elvis leaves Sun Records and gets out of sort of the tutelage and oversight of Sam Phillips and moves into the larger corporate, sort of record industry, he stops recording a lot of the black music. He does a few tracks. He does Hound Dog. He does Good Rockin' Tonight, and kind of still initially kind of keeps to that sort of MO of kind of picking songs from both sides of the spectrum. But by the time his career gets in full swing, he either has people writing songs specifically for his albums, and all of these writers, for the most part, tend to be white, all right, and they get the royalties for that. Or in the second half of his career, when he comes back, or I should say the middle of his career more so, when he comes back from the war, he's making movies. And then it becomes movie studios writing songs for him that become both the single and the soundtrack for the movie. And again, these are primarily white musicians and white songwriters. So again, one of the things that Elvis gets most criticized for is, like, quote unquote stealing black music. He wasn't stealing it, he was recording it, and he was crediting the musicians, and he was actually making them wealthy. So it's unfortunate that more of that wasn't done, because it would have probably benefited more black songwriters if he could have sang more of their music. Some of the other things, okay bud, I'll be with you in just one sec. Some of the other things that you hear talked about is his stage performance, okay? And we see Baz Luhrmann, can't say this guy's name right ever, touches on some of this a little bit. He gets on a little of these things here and there, but he didn't really tease it out that well. Elvis had a very unique look that some people loved it, some people hated it when he came out with it. And, Baz Luhrmann touches on sort of the Beale Street influence. And there's no question that when it came to kind of what we call like the zoot suits and the silk colorful suits and things, that was something that Elvis himself said that he picked up, or he liked that look because he noticed that was basically the pimps on Beale Street used to dress like that, and he always thought that those kind of were like the baddest guys on the block, and so he always wanted to pretend like he was a tough guy. And so he liked that look of the kind of flashy cars and flashy suits. So that's something that probably more than likely he did borrow from the African-American population around him at that time. But something that doesn't get often touched on is his hairdo, his famous, sort of slick hair with the large sideburns. And it was called, I think they called them ducktail, which kind of tapered back in the back. That was actually from truck drivers. Elvis also thought the truck drivers, who were predominantly blue-collared white people, poorer, low-income, white people living in his community as well, who would grow that style of haircut, and he always thought those guys were tough guys as well. So it was kind of him pulling from his surroundings, again, both white and black, to sort of incorporate this idea of what he thought was a tough guy. And just as a caveat, and probably a lot of people know this, is that Elvis was a natural blonde, but because of the tough guy movies that he watched at the theaters with guys like Sinatra and Dean Martin, but also whoever, they usually were dark-haired, and he felt like that was kind of more of a menacing, cooler look, and that they had better stage presence and they had longer careers. So he actually used to use black shoe polish to put in his hair, and that's how he got that greasy look that he often had. So all of this was him pulling from that. So again, some of it came from certainly the black community, but some of it also came from the white community. Lastly, and this is something that sort of gets touched on in the film, but doesn't really get teased out and is often widely misunderstood, but again, for the wrong reasons, is a lot of people think that Elvis's stage antics, sort of his showmanship or his gyrations, his hip gyrations and things that he was sort of known for, was something that he also stole from the black performers. And that is actually fundamentally not true. As it turns out, Elvis' gyrations and hip movements initially started when he started doing live shows, because he was so nervous. He was a young kid, and we'd get on stage. He was known as being sort of a nervous, high-energy kid, and he couldn't keep his legs still, and he was wearing these silky, suits, and they would gyrate, and he didn't know what was going on. And again, they touch on this a little bit in the film, but they don't really get at it in full depth. And so he's kind of asking, like, all the girls are going, like, what are they cheering at? What are they laughing? Like, it's you jiggling your legs. And he's like, oh, I can't stop. I don't know what to do. I'm nervous. I'm like, well, just keep going, go with it. And so he started playing it up, and then it became something he was known for. And so it's kind of like one of those things where I can try to get rid of it, or I can sort of exploit this and use it. And he became very popular for that. And in fact, because of that, a lot of the African-American black musicians started also incorporating more dance and more theatrics in their stage shows, and white musicians as well. Sort of everyone started doing it. But that was something that was pretty much wholly Elvis. And if you actually go back and look at some of the quotes from many of Elvis's black contemporaries, they're pretty clear to point that out. They say, we stole as much from Elvis as he stole from us, and especially when it came to a stage show and a stage performance. So there's a ton of quotes out there on the internet you can look up on this. This is one from Jackie Wilson. And Jackie Wilson, incredible soul singer, and a guy who was early in this movement, because he was on the Dominoes, already doing a lot of R&B work, and of course, incredible solo career. Ended up being a good friend of Elvis, as was B.B. King and Muhammad Ali and a lot of these other black contemporaries. But he said, a lot of people have accused Elvis of stealing the black man's music, when in fact almost every black solo entertainment copied Elvis. Okay, so that's just to go to show that even his contemporaries admitted that they took as much from him as he took from them, and that he was very much an original act, and that rockabilly at its inception was very unique. It wasn't as simple as just a white kid singing black music. Again, as I mentioned and showed you, he sang as much quote-unquote white music as he did black music. So the film kind of touches on all of this stuff, but maybe not as well as it should. I constantly, every time I see an Elvis biopic or film, they never talk about the white music. They never talk about Bill Monroe. They never talk about, Patsy Cline, some of these, I think it's Patsy Cline who won the song, I don't know, I may be wrong on that one. But a lot of these country western songs that he sang, and the influence of that, it sort of gets washed over, maybe because it's just not as interesting. But it's a little too simple to typecast Elvis in that regard, and it's also a little too simple to typecast Sam Phillips. Now, in the case of Phillips, I have to also mention that later in his life, as he got more sort of famous and kind of quirky, he kind of like just started playing a part. And he would in interviews say things like, well, I just need to find myself a white boy who could sing black music, and I knew I had something. And so he wasn't really helping his own cause, unfortunately. But at least at his inception, it doesn't seem like that was actually his intent. Maybe he changed his story down the road. But all this to say, it's a complicated issue. It's a sign of its time. But one of the things I do think that the film did well is to actually show that how, and B.B. King speaks about this and has spoken about this, how at its inception, when Elvis started to integrate his music, or I should say integrate black music into his music, it was at a time where there were clearly a movement towards anti-segregation, and then there were still segregationists. And the people who were still pro-segregation really targeted Elvis for sort of being lascivious and evil and perverting the children. And they actually used his affiliation with black music and black musicians in order to try to drum that up and further create a divide between white and black communities. So really this narrative that Elvis was singing all this black music and that Elvis was doing all these lascivious dance moves that he got from the black people was actually coming from white racists, white supremacists. They were the people who were trying to keep things segregated. They didn't want black music and white music coming together in the same way they didn't want black people and white people coming together. And so they were trying to take these things and take Elvis and use him kind of as saying he was a perversion and all these bad things, but they were linking that to the black community to try to sort of equivocate two things that weren't the same. But what's ironic is since then, what's happened is the anti-racist community has latched on to the same logic, and they're saying, "Oh, well, no, it was Elvis was just stealing all this stuff from the black people and using it for his own good." Well, no, that's an idea that was created by the segregationists. That was them, and that kind of gets. I'm almost done, but I'm coming. That's something that gets picked up a little bit in the movie. Then I'm glad they actually tackled that, because actually, and again, what I will close with this is what B.B. King was pointing out is that initially Elvis suffered more flack socially, at least within his own communities, for aligning himself with the black community, more so than benefiting from it. Now, in the long run, of course, we know he went on to be a superstar and a millionaire and all these kinds of things, so he certainly did benefit from it. But at least at the forefront, he did face a lot of challenges because you're living in a world where the South was still very much segregated, and there still was a very dominant racist agenda politically and socially to keep these things separated. Okay? All right, we're done. We'll stop it. All right, bye.